Good evening. I am Xavier Salomon, the Deputy Director and Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection, and welcome to this episode of Cocktails with a Curator. It is almost exactly a year since museums closed down in New York in March of 2020 and since the pandemic began. And we have been living with this new reality for the past year. Of course, many things have changed during this time, and we've been carrying on with our episodes of Cocktails with a Curator from the Frick every week. And I would like to thank you all for joining us and for continuing to join us now. And of course, what has changed, apart from everything that has happened in the world around us, is also the fact that the Frick Collection during this time has moved. We closed in March of 2020, and we have just reopened to the public this week. And of course, the space that we now are using temporarily while we're renovating the main building at 1 East 70th Street is a very different surrounding for our own works of art. Here you see the West Gallery at the Frick, as it was before we closed. And of course, this is this grand combination of paintings from different periods, from different schools. You have Italian 16th century paintings together with British 19th century paintings, Dutch 17th century, and French 19th century paintings, all mixed up together with, of course, Italian and Netherlandish bronzes and furniture mostly from Italy, in this very grandiose ensemble. One of the great paintings in this gallery, which is usually at the end of the gallery to the right, is, of course, Rembrandt's great self-portrait from 1658. And here you see it in the West Gallery against the green velvet, hanging over a Renaissance-style chair. And now all of these works are on display at Frick Madison, a few blocks northeast of East 70th Street. And here you see the Rembrandt presiding on the second floor of Frick Madison, on the floor which is devoted to Netherlandish and Flemish art from the 16th to the 17th century. And you see the room with Rembrandts House portraits flanking the entrance to the room where the grand Rembrandts self-portrait stares at us from across the room. And the power of the self-portrait is really incredible, seen in this new setting with the grid, the modernist grid in the ceiling, this wooden floor. The size of the painting is incredible. And the Rembrandt self-portrait is, in fact, the largest self-portrait painted by Rembrandt in 1658. And it is one of a number of self-portraits by the artist. As we will see, more than any other artist in the Western European canon, Rembrandt explored and recorded his image over the whole length of his career. In honor of Rembrandt and of his self-portrait, I'm drinking a whiskey sour. I think this is very appropriate for Rembrandt, partly because the whiskey being a sort of very old-fashioned type of drink, but also I feel the sort of sourness of it. It's something that Rembrandt would have appreciated. This is, of course, whiskey, simple syrup, and lemon. Cheers. We don't know who the self-portrait was painted for and who owned it to begin with. It first appears in the 19th century, and through most of the 19th century, it is in this location at Melbury House in Dorset, belonging to a number of generations of the Earls of Ilchester. And it is from the Earls of Ilchester that in 1906, Frick acquires the painting and brings it over to New York. As I mentioned, this is one of the many self-portraits by Rembrandt. It has been calculated that over his lifetime, Rembrandt painted between paintings and works on paper, drawings and etchings, more than 50 self-portraits. Probably he painted at least one every year of his career. And we don't know really what the market for these works was, who acquired them, but clearly they, on one hand, promoted the image of the artist. On the other, they were used by Rembrandt himself as experiments in paint. And he is clearly an artist who was very interested in his own image and in his own aging and in the transformation of his own body, of its expressions, and how it appeared in the world. Rembrandt was born in Leiden in 1606 and moves to Amsterdam in the early 1630s. And here you see two of the very early self-portraits by Rembrandt, the one on the left, very small painted panel, the one on the right, an etching. These are from around 1628, 1630, so just before he moves to Amsterdam. And here you see that what he's playing with effectively as he's looking at himself in a mirror is different expressions of his face, as you see on the right, but also different effects of light and the very dramatic play between light and shadow on the left. It's something that will reappear in Rembrandt's art over and over again. Just to give you a sense of how these self-portraits change over time, 10 years later in 1640, here is Rembrandt, by this point, the established artist in Amsterdam, showing himself as a grand aristocrat, as a grand man, very much in the Italian tradition. And he is clearly looking at portraits like the one on the right, the so-called man with a blue sleeve, in the National Gallery in London. This is a painting by Titian, which in the 17th century was for a time in Amsterdam, and Rembrandt must have seen it there. And clearly his painting is a very direct homage to works of art like the Titian. As his life progresses, Rembrandt continues to represent himself on canvas. And here you see on the left a self-portrait in Vienna from 1652, and from a few years later in 1660, the one on the right at the Louvre. And you see also the difference that sometimes, as on the left, Rembrandt is showing himself as a grand character, as a wealthy man, but on other occasions, as on the right, he is actually showing himself as a painter. And interestingly enough, most of the self-portraits do not show him as a painter. The ones that do show him in the act of working are an exception. This is probably the most celebrated self-portrait of Rembrandt as an artist. This is at Kenwood House in London, and it was painted in the mid-1660s. And here he is shown with his brushes and at work with a large canvas behind him with these rather mysterious large circles. There's been, of course, a lot of speculation as to what these circles may or may not mean and what they may be referring to as an idea for Rembrandt to depict on the canvas behind him. Rembrandt also showed himself often in fancy dress. And this, for example, is his self-portrait from the 1660s, from 1661, where he is representing himself as the Apostle Paul, so as one of the 12 apostles. And the very last painted self-portrait we know of is this one now in Cologne, which is almost a monochromatic work, incredibly powerful in the way in which the paint is applied, and with this grimace on the face of the artist, who is representing himself here as an ancient painter, as the ancient painter Zeuxis. But let's go back a little bit in time to the height of Rembrandt's career. So here he is as the elegant man, as the great painter of the early 1640s. And this is just painted a couple of years before he starts working, of course, on the Night Watch, the greatest commission and the most important commission that Rembrandt paints for a civic institution in Amsterdam. And just before this portrait is painted in 1640, in May of 1639, he had acquired a very grand house in Amsterdam. And this shows how successful Rembrandt was as an artist. He had amassed a considerable fortune, which allowed him to buy this house, to establish in it a great workshop, and to move in this grand house with his family. And he was to live in this house for the next 20 years. The house, of course, is now a museum in Amsterdam. It is the Rembrandts House Museum. And in the Rembrandts House Museum, there is a reconstruction of part of the collection of Rembrandts from these years. Rembrandt was a fascinating character who was interested in everything from the other parts of the world that he didn't get to know. Rembrandt never left the Netherlands, but he very avidly collected objects from America, from Asia, from a number of European countries. And here you see one of these displays at the Rembrandts House, which, of course, do not include Rembrandt's own objects, but give you a sense of the type of objects Rembrandt owned. So here you see an Aztec diadem with corals and turtle shells. And, of course, here again, a combination of shells and corals, pieces of armor, casts and original of ancient Roman busts, a number of weapons, a number of different objects. And of course, when you visit the Rembrandts house today, you really get a sense of how voracious Rembrandt's interests were in things from all over the world. And this passion was something that extended to artworks. Rembrandt bought a lot of artworks. And it is very, very clear that Rembrandt was not very good at managing his own finances and his own business. And this ends up in a huge reversal of fortune when he goes, a few years later, in 1656, in July 1656, he goes bankrupt. And this is probably due to a combination of reasons, but mostly his mismanagement of his fortune. And over the next 2 years, Rembrandt is forced, first of all, to sell at auction his art collection and his collection of curiosities, which is how we know exactly what he owned as part of this cabinet of curiosities, what he owned in his house. And all of these objects are listed in the sale documents between 1656 and 58. But all of these objects don't reach at auction the prices that Rembrandt was hoping for and don't solve his financial problems, which means that in February 1658, he has to sell the entire house. This is a difficult time in Rembrandt's life. He will move to a much more modest house where he will spend the rest of his life. He will die in this house in 1669, and he will be buried in the nearby church, the Westkerk, in an unmarked grave. Rembrandt dies a pauper. He survives his own son, Titus, and who had died a year earlier. And the last few years of Rembrandt's life are really incredibly tragic, surrounded by tragic events and, of course, by huge financial issues. And so the greatest painter of the Dutch 17th century, one of the greatest painters of the Western canon, of course, ends his career in a rather miserable way, being buried in an unmarked grave in this church. Now, our self-portrait is from exactly this time, is from 1658. So here is Rembrandt showing himself at a time when he has sold all of his belongings and he has just sold or is in the process of selling his house and moving to a much poorer district. You would never really tell this from the self-portrait. And what is remarkable about this painting is that as Rembrandt is failing as a successful painter and human being in terms of what is expected of him by society and by the world around him, he still has this grand vision of himself. And I find it really interesting that he is painting the largest self-portrait of himself at the highest moment of crisis. And I've been thinking a lot about this self-portrait during this past year because, of course, this portrait is all about difficult times and the reversal of fortune and what to do at times of crisis. And you get the feeling that Rembrandt is an artist, is a man who bounces back every time. He lives through difficult times, the death of most members of his family, through illness, through financial trouble, and yet he keeps working. And art is what keeps him going through this time. And here he has shown himself almost enthroned. And the reactions to this portrait were very, very different over the years. And I'm always amazed that one of the very first comments on this portrait is actually a negative one. So in 1815, when the portrait is exhibited for the first time, when the Earls of Ilchester lend it to the British institutions in London, the catalogue of that exhibition, the copy of the catalogue that we have at the Frick and the Frick Art Reference Library, is annotated by an anonymous commentator who writes, "He is holding a stick and looks like a great butcher, unpleasing, fine as to color and composition. So there is a sort of unpleasant and pleasing character to this portrait because, of course, it's so grand and so incredibly disturbing in many ways as you confront it. But let's look at it in the details. Rembrandt, of course, signs and dates the self-portrait on the lower right on a chair. So here you see his name, Rembrandt, and the date 1658. And he shows himself in this extraordinary costume. He's not showing himself as a painter. Looking at this image, you would not guess that this is a bankrupt painter who is selling his belongings. This is a very rich outfit with details in gold, with this grand red sash and this overcoat. He holds in his left hand a stick. And this has been interpreted by a number of art historians as a mole stick, which is something that was used for painting to help an artist paint in specific circumstances. But in fact, when you look at it, it is not. It is actually a walking cane capped in silver. He holds it almost as if he were to hold a scepter. But this is a type of walking stick which is common with a silver capping in Eastern Asia. So again, this is probably something that Rembrandt owned or had in his studio, which came from far away in the world. And you get this feeling that here is one of the objects that he may have not sold yet, or he's in the process of selling. The outfit is actually Oriental, if fantastic in many ways. This is a contemporary painting from around the same time showing Saul, King Saul, the biblical king, who is consoled by David playing the harp. And you can see that Saul is wearing this grand turban and crown, but he's wearing a very similar outfit, if not quite the same, as the one in the self-portrait at the Frick. So clearly Rembrandt is showing himself in the Frick self-portrait as a grand Oriental figure. The way this is painted is absolutely extraordinary. The closer you get to it, and you can do that at Frick Madison and see the painting under very good light, you see how it's almost abstract, the way that the brushstrokes are applied one on top of the other, these bright whites over brown and gold and yellow with little touches of red and black. It is an absolutely miraculous way of painting an image. And of course, Rembrandt's own powerful hands. And the impression you get from this self-portrait is that this is a grand, monumental man. And in fact, all the descriptions we have of Rembrandt tell us quite the opposite. He was a very small man, very modest in stature and look. So clearly he is presenting himself as a much grander figure. And I love the way in which the hands, both his right hand and the left hand holding the stick, project into the space out towards us. And of course, it is always worth remembering that this hand, the right hand, is the hand that the artist is using to paint his work, is effectively the tool of his own trade. And finally, the face. I mean, the face, of course, is the most incredibly powerful part of this self-portrait, and the way in which Rembrandt stares at us. There is this wonderful conceit where the hat, is casting a shadow that goes over Rembrandt's eyes down to his nose, and the lower part of the face instead emerges from the shade. And this idea, as you remember from one of the early self-portraits, is something that Rembrandt did over and over again, this play of shadow and light. But here there is something about the sort of casting shadow that is passing over his face and in a way over his life as he's losing his belongings and as his life is collapsing in a number of ways. And of course, the question is, what is Rembrandt projecting in this self-portrait? And I think what we're all puzzled by, and what makes this self-portrait so great, is the difficulty in reading the face of this artist. Is this a poignant, sad, tragic image of a man that is confronting failure? Or is this a defiant image, an image of rebirth, of a new beginning after a difficulty in life? We don't know. And I've seen many people standing in front of the self-portrait, and I've stood in front of it many times. And I think this is one of the wonderful things about being in communion in a way with an artist like Rembrandt through a self-portrait like this, staring into his eyes and trying to make sense of this extraordinary genius from several hundred years ago. One of the most beautiful descriptions of the self-portrait for me remains the one written when Frick lent the self-portrait to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in 1909, so just a few years after he had acquired it. And the painter and American critic Kenyon Cox wrote about this romantic Rembrandt. And he says, "It is larger than life, colossal in its size, and as in its rugged handling. It is the head of an old lion at bay, worn and melancholy, yet conscious of his strength, determined and a little defiant." And I often think of these words when I stand in front of the self-portrait at the Frick. I hope you will all come and see it at Frick Madison. It will be there welcoming you halfway through the second floor. And I raise a glass, I raise my whiskey sour to Rembrandt, but also to all of you. Thank you again for following us for this past year through these difficult times. And I hope we will all come out of these times stronger than we were before. Cheers again and good evening.